Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I prefer to talk without slides, so you'll have to forgive me. There'll be no audiovisual distraction from what I have to say. I've been very interested to hear the preceding talks today. As somebody who's worked on the history of psychiatry and the history of madness for over very long periods, I was struck by the need, as I see it, to put some very contemporary talks into a broader historical context. One of my predecessors this morning, James, spoke of a now thoroughly discredited social theorist named Karl Marx, who once said, and he was a 19th century figure, so he started with the word men. These days we would say people make their own history, but they do not make it just as they choose. The dead weight of history weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. In other words, we're all heavily conditioned by our past, which provides the context within which we act, and in many ways conditions the ways we think about the world. And we cannot escape that completely, even as we struggle to do so. So I want to talk about psychiatry in a much broader context. We heard about, just a few minutes ago, attempts to institute drug-free treatment of mental illness and how difficult that proves to be in the modern world. What's interesting, of course, is that psychiatric drugs arrived on the scene only in the early 1950s. So before that, by necessity, the attempts to cope with the ravages of mental disturbance always were without drugs, though not without some rather nasty alternatives, as I'll discuss in a minute. And likewise, when James was talking, a number of the things he referred to, the increasing influence of big pharma on the nature of psychiatric practice, the ways in which definitions of mental illness have become codified in the DSM and become a central part that everybody who works in the field is forced to come to terms with. Those two have their historical antecedents, and I will try to sketch some of the things that led up to the contemporary scene that we're all, in one way or another, familiar with, whether as therapists or as patients or as family members of those struggling with mental disturbance. So what I want to do is sketch, mostly in an American context, the arc of history that has taken us from the very origins of psychiatry as a profession to the present state of affairs. And I'll get through as much as I can of that within the 45 minutes I've been allotted, and I hope you'll forgive me that I obviously have to oversimplify and concentrate on some major themes. So one of the things that is starkly apparent when one looks back is that in the early decades of the 19th century, all across Western Europe and North America, there was suddenly a shift away from earlier methods of handling mental disturbance, which largely devolved upon the family, to the idea that by putting people in large, well, initially not so large, but specially built institutions, asylums or madhouses, that somehow this would prove therapeutic. And it's important to see that the discovery of the asylum, as the American historian David Rothman put it, was something that took place in an era of extraordinary optimism about what was possible. The belief was that in these places, these examples of moral architecture, that the very physical structure of the place, the ways in which patients were treated once removed from the world, the retreat from the world that this involved, would prove therapeutic, that it was possible to change back those who'd lost their reason or were emotionally deeply troubled into people who could live relatively normal lives again. And this was a very utopian movement in its early stages, accompanied by claims that the new retreats, the new asylums, would cure 60, 70, 80% of those who entered their doors. And it was on that basis that states across the Western world were encouraged and motivated to build networks of asylums. And psychiatry as a profession was born at the very same moment as these institutions. They were a chicken and egg problem. You can't entirely separate one from the other. In reality, of course, these claims that they could cure on such a massive scale were fallacious. It could not be done. It's not that these early institutions didn't achieve, in some ways, some remarkable results. They were drug treatment facilities, because there were no drugs, and they did emphasize psychological approaches and manipulating the social environment to get people to behave themselves again. But in reality, perhaps in the best institutions, two-fifths of the people that came in the door left within a year, restored more or less to reason, and a few more left somewhat improved. What that meant was that over time, chronic patients accumulated. Just the sheer mathematics of that situation meant that each year the numbers coming in were a smaller and smaller fraction of the whole. And that increased number of chronic patients and the growing size of the institutions which resulted created the opposite effect. Rather than a notion of great optimism about what could be done for mental illness, we moved into an era of profound pessimism. Psychiatrists had promised the earth and the moon and the stars, and they delivered something very different. The perception increasingly by the last third of the 19th century is that mental illness was a largely incurable condition. And it was a real problem for the profession to explain away why they were performing so poorly when they had promised so much. And the idea that developed, that provided them with a way of explaining away their therapeutic impotence, their failures, was to blame the patients. The patients increasingly were denounced as inferior creatures, as people blessed or cursed with a biological inheritance that made them sick. Degeneration was what explained why people were mentally ill. They were the product of what the new theory of the time had explained as evolution, but run in reverse. They were tainted creatures. The language that was used at the time became increasingly harsh. One British psychiatrist said, if these were puppies, they'd be put in a sack weighted with lead and thrown into the pond to drown, because they were such defective pieces of biology. So where did that lead? That meant that we needed to incarcerate the mentally ill, not to cure them, but to prevent them reproducing their own kind. Numbers of the mentally ill seem to be multiplying uncontrollably. By locking them away, we could take these people who had lost control of themselves and who had an inclination to breed promiscuously and keep them out of harm's way. And then in the early 20th century, some people thought, well, maybe we could deal with this problem of the mentally ill reproducing their inferior biological kind in a different way. We could sterilize them. And so programs of involuntary sterilization spread particularly in the United States. My home state of California took the lead as the most progressive state in the Union. Eventually, a case came to the Supreme Court from a Virginia young woman who had been sterilized involuntarily. It was the case of Buck versus Bell. Her mother had been institutionalized. She'd been institutionalized. We know now the cause of her being put into the mental hospital is she'd been raped by the son of the people she was staying with and impregnated, and her illegitimate pregnancy was seen as a sign that she was mad. And when that case came to the United States Supreme Court, the Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, rendered the decision, and he said 3 generations of idiots are enough. The state has a compelling interest in sterilizing these people and may do so. Within the United States, there was strong opposition to involuntary sterilization, and so while it happened on a fairly large scale, there were real constraints on it. Where there were no constraints were in Nazi Germany. When Hitler took power, he deliberately borrowed from the California sterilization law, and involuntary sterilization took place on a massive scale in Nazi Germany. And then by the end of the 30s, Hitler decided, why are we keeping these people, these useless eaters, as he put it, alive? And with the active participation of most German psychiatrists, he launched what was called the T4 program, and the mentally ill became the first victims of the final solution. German psychiatry murdered 250,000 or more patients. The technology of the gas chambers was developed to kill the mentally ill and then exported to kill other undesirables like Jews and gypsies, or indeed anybody the Nazis decided was subhuman. So that was one direction in which psychiatry developed in the 20th century, a really quite appalling one. But for people who like to think of themselves as a healing profession, sterilizing people and, more importantly, killing them is not perhaps something that accords very well with their self-image. And there's no surprise that some ambitious psychiatrists wanted to move in a somewhat different direction. What had occurred in the late 19th century as part of this movement to considering mental illness as the product of defective heredity was an emphasis on biology, a claim that madness was rooted exclusively in the brain, and that because of that, we could do nothing. But perhaps, biology could be mobilized in a different direction. One of the things that marked medicine generally in the late 19th century was a revolution that had very profound effects that we still live with today. The abandonment of the old Hippocratic tradition of bleeding and vomiting and purging, and instead the move to the laboratory, to the idea that illness was caused by microscopic little things called bacteria. And that was a remarkable development. It cemented medicine to science and to the laboratory, and it did produce, even in the pre-antibiotic era, some therapeutic breakthroughs, mostly in the form of vaccines. But if you had a child who would otherwise have died of diphtheria, choking as they were unable to breathe as a membrane grew over their airway, and suddenly a vaccine headed off that terrible fate, that was a pretty remarkable thing. The first example of that successful vaccine occurred on Christmas Eve, and obviously to great effect. So medicine's prospects, medicine's ability to deal with illness, the whole way in which we conceptualized illness, in the late 19th, early 20th century was dramatically transformed. And of course, not just in medicine, but also in surgery, because the advent of aseptic surgery coupled with anesthesia made possible all sorts of dramatic interventions with therapeutic results. Psychiatry had no such breakthrough. It was more and more the poor relation of the rest of medicine. But it occurred to some that perhaps the biological origins of mental illness lay not so much in heredity, but is in other biological processes. Was madness also the product of infection? Could that be the answer and the source of cure? Well, one of the major things that led people, especially men, into asylums towards the end of the 19th century was a condition which had been was one of the few diagnostic triumphs of psychiatry in its history, the identification as early as the 1820s of something called general paralysis of the insane, or general paralysis. GPI accounted for as many as 25% of male admissions into asylums in the early 20th century. Huge fraction. Many people initially thought this was the end state of all madness, but as the century wore on, more and more people thought, no, maybe it was something else. And we discovered what that something else was in the early 20th century. These people were actually the victims of tertiary syphilis, which had attacked their spinal cord, hence the paralysis, and their brains, hence the dramatic psychiatric symptoms that accompanied their neurological dysfunction. So here was a large fraction of the mentally ill who really had, it turned out, an infectious disease that we couldn't at that point cure, but there we were. So perhaps other forms of mental illness were also the result of bacterial infections. Now, I'll come back to that story, but the treatment, the search for a treatment for general paralysis, GPI, eventuated right at the end of the First World War in a Viennese psychiatrist infecting patients with malaria to cause a high spiking fever, and claiming that this cured people who otherwise were going to die usually within a year to 18 months in rather horrible circumstances. So here was a biological remedy for a version of madness. And this gentleman won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927 for that first of these desperate remedies I'm going to talk about. So GPI represented the idea that infection could cause madness. If that was the case, was it possible that other forms of mental illness also were the result of infection? And this notion was taken over particularly by a gentleman named Henry Cotton, who was a very well-trained American psychiatrist who trained in Germany as well as under Adolf Meyer, the leading American psychiatrist of the age, to develop the idea that focal infection, low-grade chronic infections lurking in corners of the body that were overlooked, were poisoning the brain and producing the symptoms of madness. And in an era before antibiotics, what could one do? Well, one could engage, as Cotton put it, in surgical bacteriology. That is, you could take the offending bits out. Where might such infections lurk? Well, teeth, very close to the brain, easily overlooked. Rotting teeth, poisoning the brain, you go mad. So Cotton starts pulling teeth, or has his dentist pull teeth. I interviewed this dentist who had been responsible for pulling hundreds of thousands of teeth to cure mental illness, and he was convinced that Cotton should have won the Nobel Prize. Even when I interviewed him in the 1980s, this was really what explained mental illness. But of course, pulling the teeth didn't actually cure a lot of patients. Did that mean the theory was wrong? Why, no, of course, there must be other sources of infection lurking in the body. Tonsils, take those out. Still they don't get better, those damn patients. What else might be happening? Well, they're swallowing, you see, and the germs are going into the stomach and the spleen and into the intestines. So we start taking out stomachs and spleens and uteruses and colons. And we're curing, says Cotton, 80% of the people we treat. And rich people flock to him to be treated with this new miracle cure. In fact, those who were subject to the abdominal surgery died, as he acknowledged in print, 30% of the time, but in reality, 45% of the time. And nobody among the psychiatric profession said, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Cotton came to Britain, and the lions of British medicine, all the leading figures, the president of the Royal College of Physicians, the president of the Royal College of Psychiatry, well, it wasn't yet a Royal College, said he was psychiatry's lister, the man who was going to transform psychiatry. This was the great new approach. Of course, it wasn't. Although the pulling of teeth and the removal of tonsils continued at his institution long after his death, all the way down to 1960. Now, the idea that biology, rather than being a recipe for pessimism, could be a recipe for optimism, led other ambitious young psychiatrists to look for ways to intervene. And so what we see in the 1920s and 30s is a parade of other interventions that are designed to work on the body and thereby on the mind. So one of the great discoveries of general medicine in the early 1920s was insulin, which transformed diabetes from a death sentence to a chronic illness, allowed people to live relatively long lives. But what we learned was that if you had too little insulin, that was one set of problems. If you had too much, that put you into a coma. And a young psychiatrist named Scull decided, he'd experienced this where they put drug addicts into a coma to get them through the withdrawal symptoms. And he thought, well, maybe we could use this and treat schizophrenia. So putting people into diabetic comas using insulin became for a time another cure. Scull announced he was curing 80% of his schizophrenics, and it spread all across. Now, it was such a demanding regimen because patients literally hovered on the brink of life and death, and sometimes died, that it took enormous amounts of resources. So it was never more than window dressing, but nonetheless, there it was. Insulin coma therapy often produced convulsions. Scull thought those were therapeutic. Some other psychiatrists working in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, von Modena, decided that he'd produce convulsions by another method and use them to cure a different kind of mental illness, depression. Schizophrenia, I'm sorry. He also would cure schizophrenia with this. Why so? He had the idea that you could not simultaneously have schizophrenia and epilepsy. So if you artificially created epilepsy, you drive out the schizophrenia. So how to induce fits? Originally, he tried camphor, but camphor produces abscesses and is very unpredictable. And so he found another substance, which was known as cardiazol in Europe and metrazole in the United States. And so imagine you're a patient suffering with psychosis and you're in a straitjacket and these men in white coats bring you into a room and somebody takes a very big syringe and injects something into your arm. And for the next several minutes, sometimes as long as an hour, you, as the inventor of this wonderful technique, acknowledge, feel as though you're about to die. And then you seize. You seize so massively that you fracture vertebrae and hip sockets very often. But supposedly, your depression is gone, or your schizophrenia is gone. That was a fearsome treatment. It was easy to administer, although very shocking to witness. And of course, these fractures were a sort of somewhat distressing artifact that often accompanied these seizures, not to mention the psychological horror the patients experience. Not to worry, said Maduna, they forget about it when they've seized. Except sometimes they didn't seize. It was that approach, those shock treatments, that led to the invention of ECT in Italy. ECT was developed because it was more humane, it was more rapid, it didn't involve this long period of feeling as though you were about to die, and it was really cheap and easy to do. It developed initially as experiments on animals, unusually, for these things, and then that wasn't working very well. Dogs that were given electroshocks died. And then somebody mentioned to Saletti and Bini, who were the Italians experimenting with this, they should go and visit the slaughterhouse in Rome. And there they would see pigs being prepared to be slaughtered. And they come down the assembly line, electrodes to either side of the head, jolt of electricity, pigs would become unconscious, and then you could slit their throats. Oh, well, maybe we can try that on humans minus the slitting of the throats. So there we were. Now, ECT, of all these desperate remedies I'm talking about, is the only one that survives into the present, albeit quite controversially. It lost its reputation, was used very much as, not just as a curative device, but as a disciplinary measure in the asylums, and sometimes used in extraordinary ways. For example, 6 or 7 shocks a day till people were rendered basically incontinent, unable to speak anymore, unable to walk, and then had to be brought back slowly to some semblance of normality. But 2 interesting things. It turned out it wasn't useful for schizophrenia, and of course this connection to epilepsy was completely fallacious, but also, if it was effective at all, it was for depression, not for that. And that's where it survives at the moment as a treatment for what they call treatment-resistant depression, which means depression that doesn't respond to drugs, pretty much. But it's still, there are some patients who swear at it, some patients who swear by it, and the same thing among psychiatrists. So it's controversial, it's the only one that survives. Finally, and there were many others that I've glossed over because this was a period of extraordinary therapeutic experimentation, along came perhaps the most extreme of all of these treatments. The idea that if mental illness was located in the brain, perhaps we should operate on the brain to solve the problem. So lobotomy, which emerges in Portugal in 1936, but becomes worldwide operation, mostly because of the activities of 2 gentlemen, if I can use that term very loosely, in Washington, D.C., Walter Freeman, a neurologist, and his neurosurgical sidekick, James Watts, who really launched lobotomy as a major treatment approach. Lobotomy, too, is one of there are only 2 psychiatric interventions that have won Nobel Prizes in medicine. One was giving people malaria. The second one was giving them lobotomies. In 1949, some 13 years after the first lobotomies, Egas Moniz, who invented it, was awarded the Nobel Prize. I think these days psychiatry would prefer to forget about that particular episode. Freeman wanted to become, as his daughter put it, as the Henry Ford of lobotomy. Lobotomy in its early stages involved a very scarce commodity, neurosurgeons, and an operation that could take as long as 2 or 3 hours. Freeman was impatient. He needed lobotomy on a mass scale. It really worked. So he developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy. He picked up an ice pick in his kitchen, took it in, gave a patient a couple of electric shocks which rendered them unconscious, peeled back the eyelid, put the ice pick there, banged it with a hammer, wiggled it about, did the same on the other side, gave them some dark glasses and told them they were cured. And he toured the country demonstrating this new approach called transorbital lobotomy, and he boasted that he could teach any damn fool, even a psychiatrist, he hated them, any damn fool, including a psychiatrist, to do this in 20 minutes. And sometimes he did. He did as many as 20 or 30 in an afternoon sometimes. Frightful. Now, there was then this explosion of therapeutic interventions in the 1930s, all of which claimed they were able to cure in large fractions of the case, none of which could deliver on that promise. In many ways, the era we live in now, which is the era of psychopharmacology, is an extension, I think, of these desperate remedies into the present. It too resides on claims about where the roots of mental illness lie, wholly internally in the brain. And the discovery of both antipsychotics and antidepressants was every bit as serendipitous, if we want to use that term, as the discovery of all these other things I've been talking about. Antipsychotics, the Thorazine or Largactil, which was the first of them, were discovered purely by accident. Rhone Poulenc, a French company, was looking around for drugs that it could bring to market. And the drugs industry after World War II took off partly because of the advent of a real magic bullet called penicillin. So drugs for the first time were being used on a massive scale and very effectively in the treatments of some forms of illness. And drug companies were looking for possibilities. Chlorpromazine had been isolated in Germany in the 1870s as part of the dye industry, which is where many drugs came from in medicine. But nobody had much of a use for it. But in World War II, antihistamines had been discovered and used, and here was another one. You often use Dramamine and things like that when kids are throwing up, and it makes them drowsy. And so the thought was initially, perhaps this new drug could be used in a number of ways as an antiemetic, and it was advertised in pediatric journals in the 1950s. If your kid throws up a lot, give them Thorazine. Given what we now know about that, that wasn't perhaps such a wonderful idea. Or as an anti-itch for people with psoriasis. Or another idea, since it makes people sleepy and drowsy, maybe use it as an anesthetic potentiator, as a sort of catalyst. If you've ever had general anesthesia, you'll know that it's poisonous. You're glad to have that poison because the alternative is surgery without anesthesia, which is a pretty horrible thought. But nonetheless, when you come around, until your body gets rid of it, you feel pretty darn lousy. So the thought was, well, maybe if we use this along with anesthetic, we can get away with less anesthetic and we'll reduce the side effects. Now, in those days, no constraints on how new drugs were brought to market. They were handed out like candy. Anybody wanted to try something, go ahead and do it. No idea that patients might have some voice in what they were treated. Informed consent, you've got to be joking, right? And so Rhone Poulenc gave a naval surgeon was given some of these pills because he might use it in surgery. And he gave it to some psychiatric patients. And he said, you know, this acts like a chemical lobotomy. This is wonderful stuff. And persuaded his relatives who worked in the asylum business they should try it. And that's how Thorazine came to be used on psychiatric patients. Very quickly, that became its major use. Introduced in 1954 in America, by 1956, there were about 2 million people who'd been given that particular substance, all right? And the rest of Big Pharma quickly developed analogs. How about antidepressants? Again, a similar kind of story of accidental discovery. Iproniazid was being used as a potential drug to treat tuberculosis, then a pretty serious health problem. And so in a study where the patients were being given this drug with advanced TB, which is a condition you might usually think would make you feel pretty darn depressed, was suddenly dancing around the hallways, happy. And the light bulb went off and somebody said, oh, well, if it does that to their mental state, maybe we can use it as an antidepressant. And that was where the first antidepressant came from. Of course, that whole class of drugs was revolutionized because those early drugs often had unfortunate side effects, particularly if you ate too much cheese or had other things in your diet, they could kill you. But in the late 1980s, along came SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that launched a whole new market for antidepressants. We heard something about that market from James here. So drugs enter the scene. Initially, though, for a couple of decades, the impact is relatively muted. The drug companies make quite a lot of money, particularly off antipsychotics. But American psychiatry after World War II had gone in a direction that was very different from the rest of the world. It had embraced psychoanalysis. Not in the mental hospitals, where there were more than 500,000 patients, because psychoanalysis doesn't work terribly well, and in any event, couldn't possibly be employed given the numbers involved. But for a new class of outpatient, psychoanalysis became the most lucrative, the most prestigious part of the profession. And the analysts, of course, thought the drugs were a category mistake. They couldn't possibly work, or if they did, they just suppressed symptoms. And that meant you were playing a game like whack-a-mole where you hit this symptom and it popped up over here as a different symptom. It didn't really cure things. To the extent psychoanalysts allowed drugs into their practice, it was as a way of making people amenable to psychotherapy, to psychoanalysis. They could talk to their therapist. And so. But within the mental hospital, that was where the drugs took hold. And they revolutionized psychiatry, not least because they proved so amazingly profitable for the drug companies. And as a result, they began to pump money into psychiatry and into psychiatric research in the universities that revolved around psychopharmacology. And eventually, and we can date this pretty precisely, in 1984, from 1980 forwards, what happens is psychoanalysis collapses for a variety of reasons, and biological psychiatry rules the roost once again. And once again, we're taught that mental illness resides entirely in the brain conceived of as a purely biological thing with no connection whatsoever to any events out in the social world, as James was talking about this morning. The revision of the diagnostic system that occurred in 1980, which is why I picked that date, is a crucial part of that process. It's partly underwritten by the pharmaceutical industry, and it's essential for them in many ways because it allows them to test their drugs on what purport to be homogeneous categories of things, and to bring those drugs, therefore, to market. And so there's a symbiotic relationship that develops between psychiatry and the drugs industry, and the corruption of academic psychiatry, the ways in which what purports to be evidence-based medicine, turns out to be evidence-biased medicine because of the influence of the drug companies is profound, and that's something I'm sure you may hear from Bob about later today. But it's a very important part of the story as we confront it now. So we've moved into an era where biology once again is in the saddle very firmly. To the extent psychotherapy survives in the United States, it's no longer a medical phenomenon. Most psychiatrists don't practice it, have very little training in it. It's devolved onto social workers and clinical psychologists who are a heavily feminized profession, and as a sociologist, I can venture a fairly strong generalization that whenever an occupation is dominated by women, it's paid less and regarded less. All right? So insurance companies, if they're going to reimburse for psychotherapy, pays clinical psychologists, not the psychiatrists. And the psychiatrists increasingly have developed a model of mental illness that claims it's all, once again, biological, this time a little bit different. After the fact, we want to know why the drugs work, so, because we, as I described, we didn't find them through any process of science. It was so. But why were they doing this? Well, we start learning that the brain doesn't just operate via electrical signals. There are these important things called neurotransmitters, and we keep learning more and more about them. Neuroscience comes to the fore and grows to enormous proportions, and neuroscientists come to replace psychoanalysts at the head of departments of psychiatry. So neuroscience is one enormous push. George Bush, the less worse, announces in 1991 that the 1990s are the decade of the brain, because this new science, this new neuroscience, is going to finally unwrap the mysteries of mental illness. So he thinks. So that's one strand. The other strand that increasingly comes to the fore is something that had been discredited heavily in the 1940s and 50s because it was associated with Hitler. That's the idea that mental illness is rooted in genetics. Psychiatric genetics had sort of faded away, been discredited, and then it begins to come back. Because if we're looking at why brains might malfunction and why it is that mental illness seems to run in families, obviously the idea is we'll go and look at genetics. So huge amounts of money have been poured into neuroscience and genetics. What has been the therapeutic payoff? Zero. Don't take my word for it. I'm some lowly little historian come sociologist. What do I possibly know? The recent past head of NIMH, Thomas Insel, gave an interview to MIT when he stepped down in 2015. And he said, you know, I've run this place for about 13 years. And he said, I've invested a lot of money, I think about north of $20 billion in trying to unravel the mysteries of mental illness. And he said, I've funded some really cool genetics and some really cool neuroscience. And he said, the state of the mentally ill has, if anything, gone backwards as a result. Okay? Actually, the work in genetics has tended to undermine the very categories that the DSM uses. There are an increasing number of psychiatrists who are beginning to doubt, for example, that the category of schizophrenia will survive for much longer as a diagnosis. Likewise with bipolar disorder and major depression. Major depression is a catch-all diagnosis that the DSM has managed in the ways that James alluded to earlier this morning to spread that diagnosis ever more. The diagnostic creep is quite remarkable. And so the ordinary courses of people's lives are increasingly pathologized and medicalized and treated. Not to say that there aren't cases of people who are desperately depressed. I don't want to pretend that for a moment. But the point is that our diagnostic system is increasingly falling apart. When DSM-5 was published, it was 2 years late appearing because it kept being attacked from within the profession, the whole process. They had announced they were going to base the diagnostic system no longer on symptoms like 18th century doctors, but they were going to look at the biological roots of the various mental disorders. And about 2 years in, they threw up their hands and said, we can't do it. Because they couldn't, and they still can't. There are no biological markers for any of the major mental illnesses. So having abandoned that, they went back to the tick the boxes, use symptoms to diagnose the problem. And when that manual finally appeared 2 years late in 2013, Thomas Insel and his immediate predecessor at NIMH, Steve Hyman at Harvard, who was then back at Harvard, denounced the whole thing. Hyman said it was a complete scientific nightmare. Insel said, we're not at NIMH going to support research based around these categories anymore because they're meaningless. They're made up. They're social constructions, something sociologists have been telling them for a while. So that whole diagnostic system is coming under threat. And in fact, one of the things that the genetics research has uncovered, well, two of the things. First of all, everybody thought, well, because of the family studies, we're going to uncover quickly the genetic roots of mental illness. Not so. There is no Mendelian gene or set of genes that underpin schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They simply don't exist. If we aggregate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of variations, we can explain between, with the best modern techniques now, 7 to 10% of the variance, which is not much. And moreover, what the genetics appears to suggest is that to the extent genetics matters, and it matters less here than in most forms of illness, it's a common set of defects that increase the likelihood you might develop mental illness, but it doesn't tell you which type of mental illness you're likely to get. So if you have a schizophrenic relative, you might become mentally ill, but it won't be something that's diagnosed as schizophrenia. So it therefore undermines this sense that we have cut nature at the joints, that the actual diagnoses we use really correspond to real things. I haven't had time to really talk, but the drugs, it turns out, are a very mixed blessing. For some people, they actually provide some symptomatic relief, but they are no psychiatric penicillin. They don't cure anything. At best, they provide a measure of symptomatic relief, and for most patients, not even that. Moreover, they come with a whole slew of side effects, which for years, the profession managed to downplay or ignore. But if you're a patient, are very powerful parts of your existence once you're on them. And moreover, getting off these drugs, it was something Magnus alluded to, can be extraordinarily difficult. Whether you're talking about antipsychotics or you're talking about antidepressants, tapering doesn't always work. So very often once people have been prescribed these pills, and as we saw with depression, that's done all too easily now because of this very expanded definition and how easily patients are categorized as depressed. You may be stuck. You are then on a pill with unpleasant, sometimes life-threatening side effects, but it's extraordinarily difficult for you to get off those pills. So desperate remedies for a desperate disease. One of the reasons I think we embrace these things so much is because the desperation is everywhere. Patients are often desperate. Families are desperate. So too, though, are the psychiatrists. They're desperate to make their names. They're ambitious that way. But they also want to think of themselves as healing people, as people who are intervening to do some good. So they're easily seduced. And lest you think the lobotomies and the insulin comas and the focal sepsis stuff is something only in the past, look at the moment to the vogue for deep brain stimulation, a new kind of psychosurgery, or for ketamine, or for psychedelic drugs, all of those interventions have very little scientific basis behind them at all, and very little in the way of controlled studies to show it. And indeed, for psychedelics, it's hard for me to even conceive how you could do a controlled study. It's hard to give somebody something that on the one hand produces an LSD-type trip, and on the other hand is an inert sugar pill, and tell them you don't know which you're getting. You do. So there we are. So we live now in this world where psychiatry has embraced biology to the detriment of a much broader perspective that I think is needed to understand mental illness. And we haven't escaped this history of interventions which often do as much harm as they do good. And with that, I think I'm about out of time. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your informative talk and opening that interesting window into the history of psychiatry with its questionable trials and now obviously awful errors. But we're now open for questions, please. Will you bring on the mic?
Well, hard for me to see.
Hello, my name is Andre. Thank you for a wonderful talk, very thought-provoking. You got very radical toward the end. And I'm still trying to come to grips with what you were implying. So especially with regard to biological, heavily based biological disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia. First of all, I'm curious as to whether you feel like there is anything to those disorders that can be treatable. And then secondly, with regard to the interesting school of thought with psychoanalysis and psychodynamic that you alluded to, if you think there is anything to psychotherapy, because there has been many decades of research suggesting that especially the therapeutic relationship is effective for many disorders. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that question. Let me say at the outset, I would be astonished for some of the major forms of mental disturbance if they didn't include some biological component. We don't know what it is, but I suspect it's probably there. Is that going to be the whole story? A whole slew of evidence suggests not. And in part, I think that separation of the biological and the social is deeply problematic, is actually a category mistake, if you like. Brains aren't asocial things. We are born with a brain, that's perfectly true, but the brain we have now, all of us in this room, is not the brain we were born with. It's a brain that has developed and changed and rewired and transformed as a result of the environment and the culture and the social pressures we live under. And so biology and the social are deeply interpenetrated, and I would suggest that any adequate approach to understanding and treating mental illness is going to have to acknowledge and base itself on that general approach. And indeed, you know, there are successful episodes. As I was listening to Magnus talk about the difficulties of creating a drug-free approach to treating mental illness, as a historian, I was saying to myself, but my God, from the early 19th century until 1954, perforce psychiatry tried to deal with it, and society tried to deal with mental illness without resort to drugs because there weren't any that were involved. And some of the time, those approaches I think did have positive therapeutic impact. So I mentioned very early on the utopianism that accompanied the birth of the asylum. That utopianism wasn't wholly misplaced. I think genuinely treating people as individuals, removing them from difficult social situations for a time, treating them with kindness, coaxing them back into sanity, into controlling their emotions and their cognitive dysfunctions, actually for some people worked pretty well. And I was listening to Magnus talking about how they tried to cope with their patients in a drug-free environment. And work was part of the process back then, giving people adequate nourishment, making sure they exercised, drawing them out into conversations with people, sitting them down to have tea with William Chuk if they behaved themselves properly. All of those things were mobilized and I think had positive effects. That's not to say that's the magic answer, because one of my takeaways from history is that as yet there is no magic answer to the problem of serious mental illness. It's one we understand very poorly. Not that we've made no progress, but the progress has been very limited and often has taken us down blind alleys, has led to interventions that were worse than the disease, if disease it be. So this is a very complicated problem. I do think human interaction, what I take away from the literature on psychotherapy is that no one of them can show itself to be superior, because in fact, it's that therapeutic relationship, not the theory that lies behind it, that seems to have a positive effect on people. And it is an important part of the process. Treating mental patients, part of the problem with this is that for much of the history I described, mental patients were shut up in a double sense. They were locked away and their voices were silenced. You couldn't hear them. They weren't listened to. So the experiments in Norway involving patient input, recognizing that sometimes patients are so dissociated, so departed from the reality we think we all share, that they can't make adequate choices. But very often they can, or they can be involved at least in decisions about their own future. And when they're silenced, that's when it becomes all too easy to experiment on them as though they were guinea pigs.
We have time for one more question.
Well, you kind of answered the question I was going to ask, but I'm going to say it anyway. I love to listen to sociologists speak. We are very good. I'm a sociologist myself. We are very good at identifying problems and criticizing. But I would love to hear more about your ideas, what we can do better and what is going good in the field of mental health. For example, the work of NGOs and community-based care and support, like we give in Hugrafl when I am working. It's a small and big NGO here in Iceland, but small maybe in larger sense of way.
Sure. Well, you know, I think one of the first things we have to do is abandon monism, abandon the idea that any single approach is going to produce magical results. So, yes, there are small-scale experiments which certainly seem to offer some prospects. I was very critical of drugs towards the end of my talk. I do want to make clear that for some people, I think those drugs do make a positive difference. So I don't want to come across as somebody from Scientology who tells you psychiatry is just a poisonous enterprise. For some patients, they work with relatively minimal side effects. They're a distinct minority, but nonetheless, for those patients, that's important. We shouldn't abandon that research, although one of the interesting features of the last 10 years is that Big Pharma is abandoning research on drugs for psychiatric problems. It's caused them a lot of reputational damage. Bob here has been instrumental to some degree in that and can take some credit for that because they certainly deserve a lot of reputational damage. It's also cost them a lot of money. But more importantly, they've run out of ideas about how to move in a different direction. And that's unfortunate because I think they, at some point, might, in better forms, be useful. I think one of the other features I didn't have time to talk about is that the collapse of the asylum occurred very abruptly and was replaced by essentially nothing. Community care is a fraud. There is no community to which these patients are returned, and there is certainly no treatment other than giving them pills periodically. And so much of that was motivated by the kind of neoliberal environment that James talked about this morning. It was a way for governments to slough off responsibility for an expensive and difficult to deal with population, but abandoning them to their fate has proved to be a disaster, I think. So if we are going to move forward, it's going to involve substantial investments to actually deliver. Yes, those mental hospitals had many, many drawbacks, and they allowed the kind of experimentation I talked about to take place all too easily. But they provided shelter, clothing, food. Once you dump people out, believe me, if you live anywhere on the west coast of the United States and you go into San Francisco, LA, San Diego, Portland, Seattle, tents everywhere, people decompensating in the streets. The largest places for inpatient psychiatric treatment in the United States now are 3 places: LA County Jail, Cook County Jail in Chicago, Rikers Island in New York. All hell on earth. We built asylums to rescue patients from jails. We've abandoned asylums and we put patients back in the jails. That ain't progress, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andrew Scull, for your time here today.
Thank you very much.